Hi, it's Randy Herman, Associate Broker with Keller Williams Realty, welcoming you back to Everything Real Estate, the show that aims to educate you and introduce you to experts all dealing with matters of real estate. Last time, on our first show, we talked about the steps for buying a home and the importance of putting together a really good real estate team. Among them, a realtor, myself, and we spoke with Harold Dubin of Leader Bank as a mortgage loan officer, who told us how to get a pre-approval and also the best way to get a mortgage. And today, we're going to add a third member of that team who's absolutely essential in any real estate transaction, and that's a real estate attorney. And I have the extreme pleasure of having with me today Andy Schwartz of Crowley & Cummings, who's a terrific real estate attorney used by myself, my clients, and so many people in my office. And I want to thank you, Andy, for coming.
Thank you, Randy.
Yep.
Glad to be here.
Yep. Well, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I've been an attorney in Massachusetts for going on 24 years this December. And primarily, I've been practicing in the real estate field. I have dabbled in some other areas of law, but my real concentration has mostly been in real estate. The law office that I'm with is Crowley & Cummings, as you mentioned. We have a number of offices in Massachusetts, in Boston, in the South End, and the Back Bay. We have an office in Dedham, which is where our operations center is. And we also have offices in Westboro, Winchester, Beverly, and on Cape Cod.
Right, but all you do is real estate, correct?
That's correct. We do a little bit of things that are related to real estate, but primarily we focus on real estate.
Yeah, okay,
Exactly.
great. And let's dig right in,
Sure.
Andy, and what's a real estate attorney?
Well, a real estate attorney can be in any number of different things. It's kind of a broad scope, but it's an attorney that focuses on the law, policies, and procedures relating to real estate in Massachusetts.
I see, and there's specialties, right, dealing with...
Yes, there are. So there are a number of different subspecialties that some real estate attorneys do. I focus primarily on residential transactions, residential conveyancing, which is the subset of folks who are buying, selling, or investing in real estate.
Right.
Some other attorneys handle commercial transactions primarily, and then there are other attorneys that do different types of things as well that touch real estate but don't involve transactions.
Okay, such as like homeowner associations or tenants?
Yes, yes, absolutely. We have a lot of condominiums, and some folks deal only with condominium law and condominium associations.
So I guess it's like the medical profession where everyone specializes.
It is to some degree. That's a great analogy. It used to be that you had a lot of general practitioners in both medicine and law, and now folks are getting a little bit more subspecialized. So I kind of liken it to if you have a heart condition, you would go to see a cardiologist. You wouldn't go to see an orthopedic surgeon.
Right. So, Andy, can you tell us what's the advantages of actually using a real estate attorney? I know as a realtor the advantages because I work with attorneys who are also not specializing in the field.
Right.
And from my point of view, it's much more difficult usually to try to work with them.
Right.
So what's the advantages of being a real estate attorney controlling a transaction?
Well, it's kind of along the same lines. The specialization is really key. We like to call it the My Cousin Vinny effect. You remember that movie?
Yeah.
So, if you're involved in a real estate transaction, you may know somebody who's an attorney who specializes in car accidents or divorce or things like that. And they may know a little bit about real estate from their days in law school. But it's become very specialized, and there are a lot of regulations, laws, and rules that only folks who deal with it on a day-to-day basis are aware of. And it makes the transaction go much smoother.
So these things that are in particular like the contracts and deeds and issues dealing with boundaries and things of that nature?
All of those items, right. We deal with them every day, so we're very familiar.
Well, part of what I think is the advantage is that your company has a whole team behind you. So every transaction seems to flow so smoothly. You seem to be on top of it. You get back to the realtors, to the clients so quickly, and many other attorneys don't.
Right.
And there's many times that time is of the essence.
Absolutely, absolutely. And really the important thing too is to have the folks in place, like you mentioned, the team that they know what to do when a problem comes up. When things go smoothly, it's great. Everybody can deal with that. But when there are issues, we know how to solve those issues.
Okay. So tell us, what do you do? I mean, all day long, you're doing real estate
Right.
law.
Right?
What do you do?
Well, a big part of what I do is reviewing contracts. In Massachusetts, we have purchase and sale agreements that become the contract.
Right.
But generally, I'm talking to clients all day long. I'm reviewing documents. I'm reviewing titles. All of these types of things. We are very paper intensive. We're hoping to get to a more paperless society, and
Right.
some things are getting to be more electronic. But a lot of what we do still deals with paper.
Yeah, well, right now, we're having all of our clients sign everything through .loop,
Right.
which is electronic signing. It makes things so much easier, and plus it's storage, it's electronic storage. So
Sure.
at this point for us, that's great, but
Yeah, and we're fully integrated with all of those different types of systems. But when it comes down to it, and we'll talk about the closing, I know, a little bit later, but that still involves paper. You still have to have wet signatures, as we say, ink on paper.
so you consult with the client first
Correct.
and get to know them, and they get to know you.
Right.
And then you're following through on the documents, like the offer
Correct.
and the contingencies, and then the purchase and sale agreement. And you just did one for us today,
Right.
right? Where
Right.
you went over and reviewed it and made some changes?
Yeah, it's typically a multi-step process. Everything has to proceed along a time frame. In real estate law, time is very important. There are always deadlines. Things have to be done by a certain date to keep everybody under contract and in compliance with their responsibilities.
And what happens if you don't meet the deadlines?
Well, you could be subject to losing some money, deposits, if deposits are paid and you don't comply with your obligations, you could be subject to losing those deposits, or in, certain cases, extreme cases, lawsuits could be filed. People could have to go to court to defend their actions.
I see. And then, once the purchase and sale agreement signed and the buyer gets his mortgage or goes after his mortgage, there's a commitment letter, correct?
Right, and this is also where it's critically important to have teamwork in place, and we very much pride ourselves on having the kind of the three-legged team of the real estate agent, the attorney, and the loan officer, and there's constant communication between all three of those. The commitment is a step in the process where the buyer or the borrower knows that their financing is secured. So it's important for them to comply with what they have to do, get documents back to the loan officer in a timely manner, so that the lender can issue the commitment and everything can stay on track.
Right. And then after the commitment letter comes through, or I guess simultaneously, you order a title. What's the title?
So the title in real estate is more of an idea than a piece of paper. Most folks are familiar with titles when dealing with their cars or their vehicles. So they know that when you buy a vehicle and you pay off the loan, the lender will send you the title, which is a piece of paper that says you own the property. In real estate, title really refers to the history of the property, who is the record owner with the records of the Registry of Deeds for the particular county. And it examines who has a lien on the property, what obligations there might be. And the idea is when somebody's buying property to have what we call clear and marketable title. In other words, title that's free of any defects, as we call them.
Okay, so in other words, you don't want the long-lost aunt coming in and claiming that she owns the property.
Right, you're right. You don't want
Way down
any
the-
interests
down
that
the
are not accounted for.
Are there any other problems that are,
Yeah, we deal with things like property disputes sometimes. It depends on how long the property has been in existence, subdivisions, things like that. We kind of deal with those issues. We also sometimes see probate issues, disputes between family members. Those are frequently things that we deal with as well.
okay, that's all under your purview.
It
so-
is. It is.
So you're a problem solver.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right,
Exactly.
okay. So after you get the title, a clear title, and do you also go and search through the municipal files? Or?
We do. That's part of our examination. We search the records of the town. We order what's called a municipal lien certificate from the particular city or town that the property is located in, and that tells us if there are any taxes that are due or unpaid utility bills, water bills, trash bills, things like that. Also, on behalf of the seller, we have to make sure that they haven't filed for bankruptcy, to make sure that they're free to file to sell the property. And we also now, under the regulations, have to check to make sure that the parties are not on the financial watch list, so that it's something called the OFAC, which is the federal government's list of folks who may be on
Terrorists?
terrorists or, suspected of money laundering, things like that.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So I know the next step that you deal with, and this is the big one, is the closing.
Right.
Right. So can you tell us a bit about closings and
Sure.
what's involved in the closings?
Sure. So in Massachusetts, in some states it's done a little bit differently. If anybody's watching this and they've had experience in other states out west where you have an escrow company and you have a multi-step process. In Massachusetts, we have a single closing, which ideally is when the buyer and the seller both come together at the table. We, as the closing agent, we can act as the closing agent as well, representing the lender. And we collect all the funds from everybody. All of the buyer's money comes in, all of the lender's money comes in. We have special bank accounts that we use to hold these funds, special trust accounts. And then we make sure that we have all the information as to where all that money is going to go. We're going to pay off the seller's mortgage. We're going to pay the seller any balance that's left over. We're going to pay you guys your real estate broker's commission.
Yes.
And we're going to pay anything else that's related to clear the title and make sure that everything is where it needs to be. It sometimes takes place at the Registry of Deeds,
Right.
which is sometimes in the courthouse or in a separate
And
building.
who's there? Who's present?
Typically, the buyer is always there, 99 times out of 100. But we like the buyer to be there and not be having a power of attorney. The closing attorney will be there. Sometimes the buyers and sellers will have their own separate attorneys who are there. The real estate agents are there. Sometimes the loan officer comes to the closing as well.
So when you say that the title company's attorney, but there's also a bank attorney, right? I mean, there's a...
Well, that's the same person. Right.
So the bank attorney, can you represent both the bank attorney
Yes.
and be a buyer's
Correct.
attorney?
Yep. In fact, that's frequently done.
Right. What's the advantages of that?
It's usually a money-saving expense. The buyer doesn't have to pay an extra fee to have their own attorney there and to have the lender's attorney, because they're going to be paying for the lender's attorney regardless.
Okay, great.
And it just makes the process a lot smoother as well.
And then, can you explain a little bit about closing costs? Because it's always confusing about closing costs.
Sure. Of course, they vary. They depend on the type of loan, they depend on the borrower, they depend on the transaction.
Well, what are the categories of closing costs?
So you typically have, on a buyer's side, they'll have their legal fees, they'll have the title insurance for both the lender and for themselves. There are recording fees to get paid to the Registry of Deeds. On the seller's side, they'll have their commission. They'll have tax stamps in Massachusetts when you sell property. You pay $4.56 per thousand of the sale price that goes to the state at the time of sale.
So I once heard it said that there's 3 categories of closing costs. So one has to do with the bank and the bank fees
Right.
and the bank costs.
Right.
The second has to do with the attorney and with governmental fees. And the third has to do with escrows.
Right.
So what kind of escrows are needed to?
So most times when you've got a buyer who's purchasing with a bank, the lender will require that certain funds be held by the bank in order to pay real estate taxes and usually homeowners insurance. So the bank will collect some money up front, they'll establish a separate account, and then the buyer, when they make their mortgage payment, they just write one check rather than writing a check for their mortgage and then writing a separate check 4 times a year to the town, and then another check once a year to the insurance company. They'll just write one check, and then the bank will be responsible for paying the town or the city and their insurance.
Well, for me, a big advantage is certainly working with Andy or a real estate attorney is that at the closing, they seem to explain in great simplified terms everything that's going on and make it very comprehensible.
Right. We try to do that.
A little trouble talking.
We try to do that. We've had, there's a lot of paperwork, and there's a lot of what we call boilerplate, which is standard language. There are some documents that are more important and more critical to the transaction than others, and we make sure to fully explain those. There are some other documents that are disclosures. Sometimes people say, haven't I signed this already 4 times? And sometimes we have to say, yes, you have. You've signed it before the closing at the application, but the lender wants to make sure you're signing it again.
Right. Well, I told you this funny story about when I first bought a house, and I was a young guy, and I didn't really know what was going on, and my attorney didn't explain it to me. I wound up reading every word on every single page, and people could have killed me. The closing took 4 or 5 hours. It
Right,
was-
right.
it was-
Well, fortunately, we don't have too many people like you.
yeah,
But
thank God.
if people want to do that, they're certainly welcome to. But we do a pretty good job of explaining it and kind
Well,
of
that's it.
distilling it down. They can be complex, all joking aside, they can be complex topics, and we like to distill it and break it down into things that the layperson can understand.
Are there any kind of problems that come up at a closing?
Usually, by the time you get to the closing, all the problems have been solved. Sometimes we have problems right before the closing. For example, if the buyer goes and does their walkthrough the morning of, or maybe the night before the closing, and they find that the property is not in the condition that it's supposed to be, then we have to work with the other side to make sure that either some money is held back from the seller. Let's say there's trash or debris that was supposed to be removed, or it's not, or there was some damage to the property
Right.
in between, right before the closing. You
God,
know,
I've had that experience any number of times.
yeah, I mean, sometimes you have a mover who maybe would break something or put a hole in the wall, or there was an area rug that nobody looked under, and now you discover that there's an issue. But these are all things that can be dealt with. You know, we negotiate, we work well with, finding the solution with the other side.
Yeah, well, see, what I love about you is your calm manner, and that any problem that comes up, you seem to be able to solve, which is terrific. It's such an emotional process buying
is.
a house, you know?
It is for everybody. It's
Yeah.
typically the largest purchase they're ever going to make.
Absolutely. So let's delve a little into the legality of things and go into the types of ownership, the forms of ownership. What are different forms of ownership?
So basically, there are different ways that, there are a number of them, but we'll kind of touch on the most common ones. The first that we have is just an individual ownership, where somebody, one person is just buying the property by themselves.
Right.
The next one, a tenancy in common, that can be 2 or more than 2 people. And these start to break into what happens if you have multiple owners and then one of them passes away. What's the effect of the death on the ownership?
Right, so it has future consequences.
Future consequences, exactly. And also, it also touches on some who's responsible for creditors and debts and things like that.
Okay, and then joint tenancy? What's
Joint tenancy is, so tenancy in common would be you have multiple people, but they almost, you think of it as their separate interests. So their interest would pass to their heirs if they passed away.
I see.
Also subject to attachment by creditors. If you have joint tenants, it's a little bit different. When joint tenants, one joint tenant dies, the other remaining joint tenant or tenants automatically own the property without having to go through the probate process.
And entirety, tenancy by entirety?
That's basically the same thing as joint tenants, except that that's only available for a married couple. So 2 spouses could own the property as tenants by the entirety, and that provides some additional creditor protection than the joint tenancy would.
And you go over all this with the client during,
Right.
when you consult with them?
Right, we did talk about how they want to hold title to the property.
And then there are different types of ownership?
Yes, there are. So
Fee simple?
Fee simple just means kind of like what it sounds. You just own the property straight out, as the individuals, whether they be one or multiple. We also have something called a life estate. That's when somebody just owns the property for the period of their life, and then when they pass away, they designate somebody else who would then immediately take over.
And then an ownership and trust?
Ownerships and trust, we get to that. It's a little bit more complicated. The trust is almost like another person, and the trust exists for the benefit of somebody else, whether it be a minor, somebody incapacitated, something like that.
So, in your own opinion, do you think everybody should be owning a property in trust, like a trust estate?
No, not necessarily. It all depends on your circumstances. That way, there's really no cookie cutter approach. It's important to have, when you're thinking about purchasing real estate, to talk to an attorney, a real estate attorney, and if you have an estate planning attorney as well, or sometimes your financial advisor. And we frequently work on a team basis with those folks as well, and CPAs, I would add too, because there can be tax consequences for different types of ownership.
So our team is growing.
Yes, it
in
is.
real estate.
Yes, it is. You'll have a number of other episodes here
Yes,
to talk to
absolutely.
some other folks.
We're already booked for 7 more sessions.
Wow,
so, yeah,
great.
Right. So you talked about a title and how that's a chain of ownership.
Right.
What's the actual deed then?
So the deed is probably what some folks think of that would be almost like the equivalent of the title for vehicles that I mentioned. The deed is the actual piece of paper that gets signed by the seller, and that's the instrument that gets recorded at the Registry of Deeds. That when it gets recorded, that's what causes the legal transfer of ownership from seller to buyer. to occur.
Okay, and are there problems with the deed at all, or?
There can be. There's sometimes, the deed contains the description of the property, so it can be an issue if the property is not properly described. There can be issues if the parties are not named correctly. We have to be very careful with that to make sure that everything completely matches up.
Okay. So is there any further things that you get involved in, for example, with short sales or foreclosures?
Yeah, we deal with those. Short sale is...
Maybe you can explain a little bit
Sure,
about short
sure. Short refers to not the time period, because they can take a very long time, but it refers to basically the payoff of the loan. So if somebody is delinquent or behind on their mortgage and they owe more than what the property could be sold for, there's a negotiation that goes on with the bank to say that the bank will allow them to sell the property for less than what the bank is owed. And that has to go through the bank and the investors, and the bank has to approve that.
So I know as a realtor, I've done a lot of negotiation with the banks with short sales. Do you also do negotiation with the banks?
We have done it on occasion, yes, absolutely. It's a pretty detailed and lengthy process.
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah, the seller has to have a lot of documentation. The banks are fairly strict because they're giving up some of their money, basically.
Right.
Because the option is, if the banks don't have to agree to the short sale, they could just go ahead and foreclose and try to sell the property to somebody else.
And then in this hot market, Andy, where everything seems to sell, a cardboard box and an empty
Right.
lot seems to sell, do you find that you have to deal with foreclosures in any way, or does that fall under a bankruptcy attorney or a different kind of law?
Well, that is a subspecialty. There are some attorneys that just handle foreclosures. They are the ones that actually represent the banks in that process. We see it on the other end when somebody's purchasing a property that either has just gone through a foreclosure and the bank is now selling it, or maybe had a foreclosure in the recent past. So we deal with it that way when we review the title to make sure that the foreclosure was actually done properly, because if it wasn't done properly, that's going to be a problem.
So we have a little bit of time left.
Sure.
I'm just wondering if you could tell us a few instances or issues that have come up recently, or maybe with some of your clients without naming names.
Right.
But ways in which your skills really helped close a deal or save a deal.
Sure. I could talk about both the buyer side and the seller side.
Yeah, please.
I'll start with the seller side first. On the seller side, what we like to do is, as soon as we know, and sometimes before we're even hired, some agents will contact us and they'll say, I'm looking to list a property at 123 Main Street. Can you please do a title search? And we want to check the status of the title. So we do that, and we get back to you fairly quickly so that you know this is
as
the
an
status.
agent, what a great service that is.
Yeah, and that's great because the information, there are a few problems that can't be solved, but most problems can, but they require time
Right.
and sometimes
Like,
money.
I asked you to look up a property. It was a multifamily, and then you found out that this person was in pre-foreclosure, lis pendens, and that there were all these other issues that had
Right.
come up. And so when I went to actually talk with the owner face-to-face and to see what he wanted to do with his property, having this information was a godsend.
Right, no, that's great. I'm glad we were able to do that.
Yeah.
Because, sometimes if that's not done, it may not be discovered until shortly before everybody's ready to close, and then everything just gets thrown into, chaos, and people are panicking, understandably so.
Right. So
that's
that's on the
important.
seller's side.
That's on
On
the
the
seller.
buyer's side, are there other cases, instances that you can tell us about that
Sure.
where you helped cement a deal?
Yeah, sometimes we have to get documents, sometimes we have to interpret, if we're representing a buyer and they are having some issues with financing, for example, we can work with their lender to help them get the proper things in order. And a lot of times on the buyer side, what helps save things is negotiating extensions of time if the buyer or the buyer's lender needs more time. So we work with some creative solutions. For example, I've got somebody now who's purchasing property, but of course he has to sell his current property in
yeah.
order to purchase.
The old domino effect.
The domino effect, and sometimes we have multiple dominoes. So in this case, his buyer is not ready to go. He was ready to go, but his buyer is not. So we had to work with the other attorneys on that side to negotiate extensions and kind of reconfigure the deposits so that
like
everybody
juggling
can
with a lot of-
stay involved.
A lot of balls in the air at
It
one time.
absolutely is.
Oh, my gosh.
It absolutely is.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Well, can you tell me, just on a personal level, what you enjoy about real estate law?
I think the best thing for me is working with people and helping them reach a desirable conclusion. A lot of my other friends who are attorneys, especially those that go to court, are involved in litigation. There's a lot of conflict involved. We try, although there is sometimes conflict involved in real estate law,
Right.
our goal is to make everybody reach a desirable result. For sellers, that means they're going to sell their property, they're going to get the money that they're looking for that will allow them maybe to purchase another property or do whatever they're going to do with the money. For buyers, obviously, it's going to put them in a home that they'll feel comfortable in, that they'll be able to raise their families in. And for the lenders and the real estate agents, it's a business transaction and allows everybody to profit from it.
Well,
So that's the best thing.
Yeah, on an emotional level, you're a hero because you're solving these problems and you're
Right.
making this deal happen.
Right.
On a legal level, you're taking care of just issues that no one else could.
Right.
A realtor cannot, deal with anything that has to do with the legal aspects of a
Right.
transaction.
Right. Right.
But that's your purview here.
Right, and it really works very well as the team approach. Everybody plays to their strengths and does what they do best, and at the end of the transaction, everybody walks away happy, and that's great.
Right. So do you see yourself branching out into other fields? Are you going to stay in real estate law? or-
I love real estate law. I mean, this is what I intend to do for the rest of my career, however long that's going to be.
Right. Now, how many closings, for example, do you do a year? Or how many transactions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. We're a pretty large firm, so we handle somewhere upwards of about 350 closings a month, I would say.
Whoa.
But we do have a number of attorneys, so I'm not doing all of those myself, obviously. And some months it's even more than that. So it keeps us busy, but that's a good thing. And we work throughout the state of Massachusetts, as I mentioned earlier. So we work with a lot of different lenders and a lot of different folks. So it's really a lot of fun. And sometimes I get to go out and drive around and go to different places that I haven't visited, not sit behind a desk all day,
Right, I
which is
see.
also nice.
Yeah. I'm just curious, as the last question, do you have any deals that you personally get involved in as an investor or anything of that nature? Or
No, I don't. I just like to handle the legal aspect of it, kind of keep things
Good.
on a professional level that way.
Well, Andy, I can't thank you enough. This
My
has
pleasure.
been so informative, and you are so good at your job, I will testify.
Thank you.
Right, so if people have any questions, where would they be able to get in touch with you?
So the best way to reach me is either by phone or by email. My email address is aschwartz@crowleycummings.com. My office number is 781-251-0540. And my cell, I'm always reachable on my cell phone, is 508-259-1598.
Thanks again, Andy, and
pleasure.
all of us, every team member always encourages you to get in contact with us, and we love to answer your questions.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Randy.
Thank you.